to another EPIC Talk. I'm Jake Wiener, a law fellow working in EPIC Surveillance Oversight Project. And I'm here today with Professor Brenda McQuade of the University of Southern Maine. Brendan is the author of Pacifying the Homeland, Intelligence Fusion and Mass Supervision, as well as a recent article on big data policing for the Journal of World Systems Research and many other articles. Welcome, Brendan. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
To start us off, can you give us just a little bit of your background and how you ended up studying mass surveillance as a sociologist?
Well, so my background, my PhD is in sociology from Binghamton University, which is known for historical sociology, in particular, study of long-term, large-scale social change. So my, I basically did a police institutional ethnography of fusion centers, which is not a normal topic of this department. What brought me to fusion centers was, really coming to terms with, the war on terror as a teenager. I grew up in southeastern Connecticut. My congressman was Robert Simmons, who is a CIA and military intelligence veteran in Vietnam. And he, he ran an interrogation center. He ran what, you might impolitely call a paramilitary death squad. And as a congressman, he sat on a congressional subcommittee that was putting in place some of the policies that would eventually govern fusion centers. And, in the lead up to the war in Iraq, I got very interested in involved in the anti-war movement. I became interested in the career of my congressman. And then, I came to think about, Homeland Security as the domestic application of counterterrorism. So thinking about it in those terms, made it more of a natural fit for the kind of theoretical orientation of my grad program. And from there the project developed. I had a brief failed interregnum where I tried to freelance my way into journalism. But that's the short of the story, how I came to focus on fusion centers.
Yeah, I relate to a lot of that. I think that growing up, for me, like 9/11 is actually one of my first really concrete memories. So that squares well with my background. Before we jump further in, can you tell us what a fusion center is and why we should be particularly concerned with them?
So what fusion centers are interagency intelligence centers. The term is most strongly associated with DHS, and there's 80 now, a network of 80 fusion centers recognized by DHS. They're operated by either municipal police, if it's a metro fusion center for a big city, or the state police, if it's a statewide fusion center. Fusion centers, in theory, they were created after 9/11 to connect the dots and prevent intelligence failures. In general, they enter agreements with other government agencies, with third-party data brokers, with private organizations to remotely access their data. They also will different fusion centers will set up build their own databases that are fed by particular surveillance systems. So in some fusion centers, automated license plate readers feed into them. Others, CCTV cameras throughout a city might feed into them, shot spotter microphones, etc. Fusion centers take all these disparate data streams and refine them into useful intelligence. They quickly expanded from a narrow counterterrorism mission to a kind of nebulous all crimes, all threats, all hazards mission. So I think there's two, maybe three areas of concern. First, there's, just the um, concern about, you know, public data collection on the basis of, universal suspicion, right? So fusion centers collect data on essentially anyone or anything, often on flimsy grounds, right? So they will monitor protests on the basis of situational awareness, right? They couch it as, facilitating public safety and the right to, basic rights of speech and assembly, but it's, it's what I call in my book this human rights compliant mode of political policing, right? So, from this first point just about public data collection, there's the second point about political policing, right? Fusion centers have monitored like every major social movement organization in the last in social movement in the last 20 years, from anarchists and the altered globalization movement all the way to the present Black Lives Matter movement and everything in between. Their fusion centers are routinely criticized for the poor quality of their products and poor professionalism. And if you look at a lot of fusion center products, they the analysis isn't great, and there's a lot of what people call threat inflation. So when we think about, say, the Dakota Access Pipeline protests or the last summer's George Floyd rebellion, I think there's real serious concern that poor quality intelligence coming from fusion centers inflated the threat of these protests and increased the and fed into the disproportionate police response, like characterized by excessive force, right? So there's those 2 points. The most important concern of fusion centers is one that I think flies under the radar, and that is that fusion centers are kind of the nervous system of the carceral state, right? They're fusion centers. The majority of what they do is criminal intelligence. They support law enforcement. They're an apparatus of mass criminalization, right? And this is what I think is the most concerning piece about fusion centers, particularly in our present moment where we're in this kind of ambiguous moment of criminal justice reform, and prison populations are declining, and some people are pushing for more structural changes, and others are trying to change everything so it may remain the same, right? And we'll end up with, from mass incarceration to mass supervision, right? So I think fusion centers' role in, as an adjunct of the carceral state, as the information processing system that goes along with, mass incarceration is makes up the majority of their work and is also the most concerning and most important.
Yeah, that's great. I think we'll roll a little later onto talking about policing surplus populations. Just to echo with kind of my understanding of fusion centers, the way that I think about them is that they're gasoline that gets thrown on the fire. So, right, police are always going to be monitoring protests, but fusion centers give them all these new tools, great facial recognition, cheap access to Celebrate and other cell phone hacking, access to all of these databases that are nationwide or held by DHS. And then they're also throwing gasoline on the fire of inaccurate information. So you get like a small piece of intelligence, it's false, faulty report. If that comes to a local police, then it kind of stays in that area. But when it gets kicked up to a fusion center, it's spread all around the country, spread to DHS. So I really view them as accelerants. That's part of why I think that they're a really good topic. So I know that you have a brief presentation about the recent effort to defund the Maine Information Analysis Center. And we would love to hear from you a little bit more about that push, how it's going, and anything unique about it.
Okay, yeah, so I prepared, some brief comments, and it's about the current issue in Maine, but it's also, trying to make the case, and make the case for surveillance abolition, and draw the distinction between, the surveillance regulation and surveillance abolition, right? So here, I'm trying to bring, share with you what I think is the unique perspective I bring as someone studying these issues, as a historical sociologist, right? So just this past Monday, April 12th, legislators in Maine held hearings on a bill to close the state's fusion center, the Maine Information and Analysis Center, or Mayak. Right? It was the first time that legislators in any state have considered closing a fusion center. It took some dramatic events to put the questions on the agenda of the state legislature. In May, a whistleblower alleged that the Mayak spied on activists and illegally maintained a database of gun owners. The scandal deepened in June when Distributed Denial of Secrets, a WikiLeaks-like transparency organization, published 5 gigabytes of Mayak data as part of BlueLeaks, a 269 gigabytes of police data that was hacked from 251 websites. Initial reporting on BlueLeaks in Maine confirmed some of the whistleblower allegations and focused attention on a series of civil unrest reports on the racial justice protests that swept the nation in Maine in early June. These intelligence assessments assembled open source information and presented them with reports from other fusion centers and FBI field offices. All of these reports warned of possible pre-staged bricks and paid protesters. Subsequent reporting debunked these sensational claims, tracing them to social media rumors from a pro-Trump biker and obviously satirical websites. As a result, a bipartisan group of legislators are working to close the Mayak. Democratic Representative Charlotte Warren introduced LD 1278, an act to end the Maine Information and Analysis Center, and secured Democratic, Republican, Independent, and Libertarian co-sponsors. This proposal brings together unlikely allies like the Assistant Majority Leader of the Maine House, Rachel Talbot Ross, who is the first Black woman to serve in the Maine legislature and the first Black legislative leader in Maine history. Also supporting the bill is Representative John Andrews, an arch conservative that defected from the GOP to join the Libertarian Party in December 2020. If passed, the bill will have major implications. Within Maine, it could help inaugurate a new political agenda focused on meeting needs and not criminalizing behaviors. The proposal to shut down the Mayak joins other bills to decriminalize drug possession, cut the budget of the Maine Drug Enforcement Agency in half to fund community-based drug treatment, and close Maine's last youth prison. There are also national implications. The events leading up to this proposal have parallels across the country. In September, a whistleblower complaint from Brian Murphy, a senior DHS official, charged that DHS leadership blocked the dissemination of some intelligence reports and modified others, all for transparently political reasons. Moreover, journalists across the country, many with The Intercept and others with independent media, have mined BlueLeaks for exposés on civil liberties violations and police surveillance, right? And these exposés are, being received in a media market, right? It's been transformed by the George Floyd protests and this kind of increasing critical scrutiny on law enforcement, right? National organizations are also watching Maine. The Electronic Frontier Foundation endorsed LD 1278, which hopefully will become a proof of concept for similar efforts around the country. So shutting down the Mayak could be the first domino to fall. It could be part of an important and needed reforms in Maine and across the United States. So with that said, there's 2 implications that I want to highlight. Right, first is this proposal to close the Mayak could be a model for a bipartisan push to roll back post 9/11 surveillance and counteract the renewed push for a domestic war on terror legitimated as a response to the far right after the Capitol riot. So in the last decade, there's been bipartisan action on criminal justice reform, and although there is much to criticize, there has been some real results. State and federal prison populations are down 10% since 2010. And in our present post-George Floyd moment, where defund the police is a serious demand and abolition has broken through, the proposals being considered, especially on the state and local level, are getting much more ambitious. Right? I hope our fight against the Fusion Center in Maine could help deepen and extend this reform push beyond the criminal legal system narrowly defined to take on matters of national security, intelligence, and surveillance. Right? Second, I think the fact that we're fighting to shut down the Fusion Center and not regulate it could help open a wider, political horizon. So consider Amazon and Microsoft's announcements this last summer that they weren't going to sell facial recognition to police anymore. These were just partial moratoriums. They weren't giving up on the market. They were waiting for the market to be regulated, right? The legislators sponsoring the bill to close Maine's Fusion Center are very aware of this project. The bill to shut down the Mayak is complemented by another bill for a statewide facial recognition ban, right? These bans are important because what we're up against is not just the abuses of this, security apparatus, but the security industrial complex. Closing fusion centers and banning facial recognition are also about limiting the market for surveillance technology, right? All of this speaks to a political analysis that includes a current concern for civil liberties and privacy protection, but also goes beyond it, right? So what separates, my book and my work from other similarly rigorous academic studies on what can be called big data policing is taking the basic fact that policing is the administration of poverty and related problems as a starting point for a theory of security in the development of the modern world. In the early modern period, the period between the Renaissance and the French Revolution, police and prisons emerged to force the transformation of peasants into proletarians, a global process that included the slave trade and the plantation system. Later, police and prisons disciplined the working class and regulated the labor market. Today, they target surplus populations. Now numbering in the billions globally, surplus populations are the mass of humanity that is no longer needed as workers or consumers, and as such, no longer protected as citizens or even humans with basic rights. In the specific context of the US, fusion centers are part of this ongoing shift from mass incarceration to mass supervision. We're replacing prisons with police surveillance, reducing prison populations without addressing the underlying social problems that made the United States the world's top jailer. So this development holds significance far beyond the criminal legal system. Fusion centers are part of a new pattern of administration through a logarithm to maintain the status quo in a current conjecture defined by low growth, soaring inequalities, sharpening class conflict, and escalating global instability. So the stakes of the Mayak fight is not just the fact of surveillance or the infringement of privacy, but the formation of the pacified subject, right? The big issue here is how police power produces people that submit, if not consent, to the present order of things. Surveillance is administration, the management of people and things within hierarchical relationships, organizations, and societies. These hierarchies are shaped by a systemic logic, the law of value, or put differently, the fact that our global society is organized around the endless and infinite expansion of private wealth. So this analysis, I think, helps us draw the line between surveillance regulation and surveillance abolition. So let's grapple with the paradox of traditional reforms for a moment. Efforts to ameliorate the excesses of state power can often entrench and perpetuate those same abuses. So consider the stance of the premier civil liberties organization, the ACLU, towards fusion centers. In 2008, they identified a series of problems with fusion centers: ambiguous lines of authority, private sector and military participation, wholesale data mining, and excessive secrecy. They recommended that US Congress and state legislators work to increase oversight of fusion centers, regulate flow of information between fusion centers and the private sector, clarify how and when military personnel can collect intelligence for law enforcement reasons, and strengthen open records laws. The ACLU did not demand an end to any of these practices. Instead, they sought to regulate and thus codify them. So challenging fusion centers on these terms will produce at best limited public oversight, such as, an ACLU representative on a fusion center's executive board, perhaps some modest restrictions on intelligence gathering, a 3-month retention period for certain kinds of data, which would only be contravened in exceptional circumstances, like an emergency warrant or administrative subpoena. So in this way, traditional reformist politics can reify state power, right? Privacy is often understood as a universal right to be asserted against the encroachment of outside parties. This positions the right to privacy, or the state, as independent entities that stand apart from the social relations and political processes that historically created them and still imbue them with meaning. This way of thinking transforms historically specific social relations and the ideas that animate them into abstract things. The private, however, is not a natural condition that is always and already in opposition of the state to the state. Instead, it is a particular claim articulated within a particular context, 16th century liberal theory. It's a concession that the consolidating administrative state made to the public. Privacy has no essential essence. It is a shifting boundary with demarcations set and reset by the state. The meaningful foil to the private is not the state, the public, but the criminal, or the other activities outside of the state, but disallowed by the sovereign. Rather than a basis of resistance, privacy can also be thought of as a tool of regulation, privacy as pacification. So in a social world governed by the commodity for and wage relation, privacy entrenches the very separations between people presupposed by capitalist social relations, right? And that security is also used to enforce and maintain. Privacy promises a life apart, a mode of existence separate from others, and to this end, presupposed by our appearance as individuals who are autonomous from each other and can therefore choose to be detached and apart, right? And it's in this way that privacy can further alienate social relations and fetishize the process that define our lives as mystified things. So for this reason, opposition to surveillance and police power can often amount to a moral critique, an appeal to law, and a demand, sometimes only implicit, for further regulation. Right? This moral critique is simultaneously a performance of and a productive investment in a particular conception of the social world. Insofar as it remains uncritically wedded to privacy, the efforts of civil libertarians can represent the liberal counterpoint to the law and order advocacy of some criminologists and law enforcement practitioners. While the former highlights accountability and the latter emphasizes effectiveness, both offer better surveillance and policing. In contrast, the solution promised by abolition is a new politics rooted in a conception of human need, one that seeks not only to meet needs as needs, but builds momentum towards systems transition. So remember, the present pandemic is but a foretaste of the greater horrors that climate change will bring this century. Last summer's racial justice protests demanded this type of change. It was an emphatic rejection of the prevailing order of things combined with an expansive solidarity oriented towards the construction of a new world. Defund the police and invest in care. So in this way, the fight over the Mayak is the same fight as ongoing efforts here in Maine to stop criminalizing substance abuse. It's the same fight as all the campaigns that started or accelerated as a result of last summer's protests. Efforts to ban facial recognition, to remove police from schools, to redirect funding for police and prisons into mental health, drug treatment, or housing, to pay workers a living wage, to be serious about climate change and strike a new deal. So that said, I'm going to close with some words I contributed to What's Next, a report from Interrupting Criminalization, which is a research initiative led by Woods Irvin, Miriam Cava, and Andrea Ritchie at the Bernard Center for Research on Women. So the antithesis of police is the commons. We're not asking for kinder, gentler cops. We're asking for the recreation of the commons, shared resources, infrastructures, and knowledge to allow communities to self-govern, and thrive. The goal is collective flourishing and common acknowledgement of our shared humanity. How does that translate into actionable demands? A certain social democratic common sense fits into this framing. A universal right to cradle to grave care, a basic right to life. To make these common goods, they need to be universal and decommodified. That is, we have to agree that housing and healthcare, for just two examples, are universal human rights, not commodities that the state will selectively subsidize or deny in order to control the so-called dangerous classes or force compliance with sexual, gender, and racial norms. But there is also something greater, a faint light on the horizon that abolitionists have long labored to draw forth, and that recent events have now made visible to many long lost in the darkness. Recreating the commons means more than better social policy. It means free access to things that make life worth living, decommodified in collective arts, culture, and recreation. It means more than access to things and services, but a new conception of humanity and community, a new order focused on common flourishing and not the accumulation of private wealth. So with this said, closing and not regulating the Mayak and other fusion centers would be a small contribution to building this world, right? It's an act of self-defense in response to the overdeveloped police powers of the state and its corporate allies. It would be a small reassertion of autonomy and a reclamation of collective self-determination. It would be a powerful rejection of the cynical agendas of the security ghouls who want us to fear and hate each other, and our Silicon Valley overlords that want to monetize every aspect of our increasingly digital lives. It would be a refusal to go quietly into the night and a reminder that another better world is still possible.
Thanks, Brendan. There's a lot for us to get into there. I just want to start by flagging that I'm really glad to hear some critiques of privacy, because I think it's important for folks in the privacy world to hear these critiques and to really be thinking about how our actions are making people's lives better, and centering that in our work. So a lot of questions for you, but I think we'll start with the push to close the Mayak. Do you have so far any lessons that you've learned, takeaways or surprises about this effort that you think apply more broadly?
Well, there's a few things. I mean, there's one that, any politics is about opportunity structures, right? And the thing here, the opportunity was, the overlapping series of events, right? The whistleblower complaint, and then the George Floyd protest putting critical scrutiny on law enforcement, and then Blue Leaks. And these things all conspired to put the Mayak on the agenda. And I think, as I tried to make the case, I think these conditions are at work elsewhere. And I've been contacted by people in other states who have caught wind of our bill and are working on it. The other thing I would say, though, is that it's extremely challenging to take on the police, right? We tried incredibly hard to get someone in law enforcement to testify in support of this bill, right? Many people in law enforcement in Maine are willing to speak privately against the Mayak, denounce it as intelligence spam, cop spam, repeat what everyone already knows about fusion centers, and that has been documented by, nonpartisan government auditors, by the civil libertarian organizations, by, the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute, by the US Senate, right? Fusion centers are a failed program. They're abusive, duplicative, a waste of money, right? People in law enforcement know this, but they're very hesitant to speak publicly about it, right? So on our testimonies on Monday, we had a great collection of people in the harm reduction community, in working on drug policy, working on we had someone who had been monitored by the Mayak as because they're an anti-masker. We had people talking about the monitoring of environmentalists, right? But when it came time to testify against the bill, we were confronted by a wall of blue, right? A number of law enforcement, and not just local law enforcement from Maine, but we also had, the law and order lobby from outside of the state. So what's his name? Mike Senna from the National Fusion Center Association, and the head of the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center, one of the larger fusion centers in the country. He came to testify in opposition, right? We had the local head of the Maine Sheriff's Association, right? So, it remains to be seen what will happen. The bill is, we just held hearings, and there's a few steps before it could get to the House floor. I think there's a very good chance it will get to the House floor, but I think what would have really helped us quite a bit would be if we had, if there were some more law enforcement that was willing to, break the code of silence and speak the truth about the fusion center.
Yeah, and so this effort has come out of just a storm of bad press for the Mayak. But the problems at Mayak are certainly not unique. And for my research, they're shared by fusion centers around the country. Do you have thoughts on how unique Mayak is, or is it just that it kind of got this wave of bad press that happened to cut towards the right wing as well as the left wing?
Yeah, I don't think the Mayak is exceptional at all. I mean, there's a saying in the fusion center community: if you've seen one fusion center, you've seen one fusion center. Given the way fusion centers operate, each one has their unique profile. So, there's a lot to be said about what the Mayak does, who's there. It has its unique profile. Every fusion center has its unique profile, but they have these common problems, right? And that's you know you know, monitoring of overcollection of material, monitoring of people accused of no crime, political policing, and then the role of the, over criminalization of social problems. So I went through all the Blue Leaks documents on the Mayak, and many of them concern, you know, uh, people with untreated mental illness struggling to live in the margins of society who become coded as problems of public order and problems of the police, right? So the Mayak writes up an intelligence report about it and blasts it out to the state, right? When I was doing the research for my book and I was in fusion centers in New York and New Jersey, these are bigger, much more urban states, higher crime. The fusion centers were more focused on violent crime. They're focused on drugs and gangs, or drugs and guns, excuse me. But it was the same issues, right? It was political policing, duplicating effort, spamming local cops with information that wasn't useful, and then over criminalization, right? So I don't think the Mayak is unique. I don't think it's unique. It has its unique profile, but it doesn't have its unique problems. And I think fusion centers are really vulnerable right now, and organizers in different states need to look at their opportunity structures, right, and see if 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 there's a chance to take it on. Right now, the place I'm most optimistic about is Minnesota. There's a proposal to expand the fusion center there, and people are starting to organize against it. And hopefully there'll be a bill in Minnesota modeled after ours, right? And Minnesota is obviously important because that's where the George Floyd rebellion began, and it's also the first story The Intercept. Thank you. The first story The Intercept dropped from Blue Leaks was about the threat inflation of protesters done by the Minnesota Fusion Center, right? And the proposal to expand the Minnesota Fusion Center, didn't acknowledge that and said we need to expand the Fusion Center to fight right-wing extremism. So, if I could write my own ticket, we'll pass this bill in Maine, and then it'll set us up for an even bigger fight in Minnesota that I hope, will have even greater implications.
Yeah, and it's great to get an idea of where these fights are breaking out. I think we can transition to your book for a little bit and talk about that. One of the things that strikes me about your book is how you pay careful attention to place. And you're really careful to situate New Jersey's Regional Operations Intelligence Center in the city of Camden, which it surveils, and take a look at how the political economy of Camden makes it a site of mass surveillance. So can you talk a little bit about the importance of thinking about policing in terms of location, both economic and physical?
Well, the thing with, when I went to the ROC, the New Jersey Regional Operations Intelligence Center, they were focused on Camden. The ROC is actually located in East Ewing Township, which is a Trenton suburb and very wealthy. But, the places that Fusion Center analysts are focusing on, right, the places that are occupying their time are not, are not affluent suburbs. It's, the struggling cities of New Jersey, places like Camden, places like Paterson, Jersey City, Newark, places with serious violent crime, right? And I think like the reason I opened my book with Camden for a number of reasons. I mean, one, it's what hit me in my hit me in the face as soon as I entered the field, so to speak, right? The first, I think it was the third interview I did was this crime analyst who, or the manager of all the crime analysts, the state police supervisor supervising all the crime analysts, and they were working up these intel products, mapping out drug distribution networks in Camden, right? Um, so this immediately just upends the uh, apparent common sense about fusion centers. The apparent common sense about fusion centers is they exist for counterterrorism and they don't work very well. And I found people working very hard, but to supercharge the war on drugs with the most advanced surveillance and intelligence analysis available at the time. So what I think is important is you know is starting from the ground up, right? Starting from the part and building the whole, right? And when I think about um, my comparison, right? I looked at New York and New Jersey, and if you look at just the formal fusion centers, you'd get a false picture because the New York Fusion Center, the New York State Intelligence Center, is kind of a victim of bureaucratic rivalries. New York has probably the most developed intelligence apparatus, police intelligence apparatus in the country. They have something like 15 county crime analysis centers, right? And the NISIC, the State Police Fusion Center, not only competes with those crime analysis centers, but it also competes with the NYPD, which I'm sure everyone at EPIC knows. Like NYPD has a huge intelligence operation. They act like they're a federal intelligence agency. They don't respect jurisdictional boundaries. They do whatever they want. So if I had just focused on New York versus New Jersey, if I had focused on the DHS recognized fusion centers in New York and New Jersey, it would look like New Jersey is a model fusion center. New York is dysfunctional, right? But if you pan out and just look at the broader police intelligence, the world of police intelligence, what you see is a broader transformation that is prefigured by the intelligence innovations in New York City, right? And New York is actually ahead of the curve, right? It was setting up these county level crime analysis centers at the same time that DHS was setting up fusion centers, right? And the big motivation, when you look at it this way, when you look at it from the perspective of just police intelligence in general and not fusion centers in particular, right? It kind of shifts the picture. It's not about counterterrorism anymore. It's about managing violent crime in very impoverished and unequal cities, right? And I think then we get a different picture. Fusion centers all of a sudden get transformed from a narrow matter of surveillance and national security into they get put into conversation with all the issues that we confront when we think about mass incarceration in our overdeveloped and overly punitive criminal legal system.
Yeah, so I think we're going to close on time, but I'd just like to bring up one last question, which is a critique of fusion centers that I haven't heard from you, but I think is important to think about, which is that, from my perspective, one of the other critiques of fusion centers is that they're intensely anti-democratic, and they make it very hard to have real discussions about, and public discussions about how money is spent on the police, because they're behind closed doors and they're able to pull in very expensive surveillance technologies aside from local police budgets. I think it's great that we're thinking about banning facial recognition, and those bans are really important. But to the extent that we're thinking about cutting off money for facial recognition, we have to consider that fusion centers can provide an end run around local funding. And so I think that for local efforts, we need to be looking at fusion centers as just this like escape valve that evades oversight and also evades any kind of democratic checks.
Right. I mean, I would agree with that, and I would like push it a little further. This gets kind of maybe into a different area, right? But one of the main lines of theorization that my book engages with is this state theory, and there's a Greek Marxist, Nico Poulantzas, who wrote this book, State Power Socialism. And he was basically one of the first people to talk about, what we now call neoliberalism. But he talked about it in terms of authoritarian statism. And his point was essentially that now that capital is global and not just national, it puts a lot of pressure on the state, right? The state can't discipline capital the way it used to in the early 20th century and before that. Right now, corporate power in many ways transcends the state and plays different states off each other, including very powerful states like the United States. So what that means is it's very difficult to have the type of relatively consensual, stable class compact we had in the New Deal period, where you had this pretty nice agreement between labor, capital, and the state, right? So why am I saying this? I'm saying this because what the solution to the increasing structural power of capital was for the state to become this like permanent crisis management apparatus, right? And this entails the expansion of security, but it also entails the restriction of democratic deliberation, right? So I think you're exactly right, Jake, when you're talking about the funding of fusion centers, but it also goes further than that. Like fusion centers were created fusion centers aren't governed with binding regulations. They're governed on the basis of these baseline capabilities that DHS recommends them to meet. These baseline capabilities were drafted in large, interagency working groups that included participation of, law enforcement and professional associations of law enforcement. So fusion centers were created by and large outside of, legislative mechanisms. They're self-governed outside of legislative mechanisms, right? I think we should see like a parallel, maybe to push things pretty far, but, I think we should see something like, the American Legislative Exchange Council, right? And the public policy, the process of forming public policy that governs fusion centers, the grant funding that governs them, all of them are symptomatic of this, changed state form, that Poulantzas called authoritarian statism, and that we can discuss in many different names. But I think the important point is that that this is a broader response to structural conditions related to the power that global capital has over states, right? And that's if we want to fight the surveillance state, we need to also think about how to restrain global capital, right? Which is no easy task, of course.
Yeah, so just echo that I think it's important we're not looking back to the 1950s when we're thinking about privacy, when we're thinking about security, but that we're looking forward to building the world that we want with all the technology that we have now. I think that's about all we have time for, Brendan. So thank you so much for being with us. It's been great, and I'll just plug your book. Please read Pacifying the Homeland. I enjoyed it a lot.